If you work an 8-hour day, somebody on $160,000 a year earns in the first 2 hours the daily rate of somebody who is on the minimum wage. So from 9 till 11, they've already earned what somebody on the minimum wage will earn all of that day.
Yeah.
It's a considerable amount of money. It's not, Gina Reinhart money. It's not, bank CEO money, but it is a lot more. And that's why they're in the top 7% of taxpayers.
And why The Rock is tall.
Yes.
Doesn't matter if you put him next to Shaq. He's objectively tall.
One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be in Australia.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. The Treasurer knows.
I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
G'day, and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains big economic issues in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and today we're going to be covering what has become a massive debate in the past week or so. Though obviously Follow the Money has been talking about them for a lot longer than that. That's right, we're once again diving into the Stage 3 tax cuts.
Doubt is growing over whether Labor will stick to its promised tax cuts.
An obvious change from the federal government in some of its language around the Stage 3 tax cuts.
Well, they're looking at changing it. They're not looking at scrapping it.
It's a ridiculous mistake.
Potential broken promise from Anthony Albanese.
We're committed to delivering what we said we would.
Our position on Stage 3 has not changed.
Officially, the government's position hasn't changed, but it appears to be testing the mood ahead of the budget.
There are huge pressures coming on the budget.
Those tax cuts are effectively unfunded.
Most economists don't believe that the tax cuts are right for the times.
Someone on $200,000 a year will be $9,000 better off.
And that's giving those who are on very high income benefits, whereas I'll go back to this issue again of giving relief to working class families.
Tax cuts should be for lower income people.
Why, of all things, would you be giving tax cuts to the rich when people are struggling to meet their daily cost of living challenges?
Is the bigger risk to break the promise or keep the promise?
So, with the federal budget just around the corner, there are some big decisions looming in terms of the federal government's priorities. Labor has been under a lot of pressure to repeal the Stage 3 tax cuts, including from us here at the Australia Institute. Pretty much since they were first introduced in 2018, we've been consistently producing research that has shown these tax cuts are just a bad idea. But today we wanted to bust a few new furphies that are emerging and tell you about some new research we've just released. And with me in the room are two researchers responsible for a lot of the Australia Institute's Stage 3 tax work, our senior economist Matt Grudnoff and research economist Eliza Littleton. G'day Matt and Eliza.
G'day, Em.
Hey, Em.
Hey, thanks for joining me. Matt, for those people who may have just tuned in the last week, what are the Stage 3 tax cuts?
The Stage 3 tax cuts are the third stage, and Stage 1 and 2 are already part of the tax system. They're already in place. And the third stage is by far the largest stage, and it's also the stage most skewed to the top end. So they're enormous tax cuts. And by enormous, I mean $250 billion over the next 10 years enormous. And they overwhelmingly go to high income earners. So about half of the Stage 3 tax cuts over the next 10 years will go to people earning more than $180,000 a year. So enormous tax cuts, mostly to high income earners.
Okay, so that's what we're talking about overall. And we have gone through a whole range of different research that the Australia Institute has produced. Eliza, I'm just going to ask you about something specifically. Matt's talked about half of these income tax cuts being directed to high income earners, but they also overwhelmingly benefit one gender over another.
Yep, absolutely.
I wonder which.
Yeah, 50-50. No, I think it's a bit more skewed than that. Yeah. So because the Stage 3 income tax cuts go to high income earners, they also predominantly go to men who are more likely to be earning more money because they're in higher income jobs, they're in more stable work in industries that pay better wages. So in actual fact, men will benefit twice as much as women from the distribution of the stage 3 income tax cuts. So they'll get 67% of the benefit, while women get 33% of the benefit.
So 2/3 going to men, 1/3 going to women. Yikes. I know we've also done some work, Eliza, around what kind of occupations, just to keep this recap going, who is winning in terms of, if we think about in terms of people's occupations, where's the primary benefit going?
Yeah, so also no shockers here. People who benefit the most work as, CEOs of large banks and surgeons, financial managers, even our federal politicians here in Canberra. Whereas cooks and hairdressers, aged care workers, receptionists and waiters, people we think of as being, more traditionally working class and whose average incomes are much lower than or around $45,000 a year, will get nothing from these stage 3 income tax cuts.
So in summary, Matt, they're pretty unfair. They're pretty rubbish. That would be our, assessment overall.
Oh, yeah. Look, these tax cuts are terrible. And they're not just terrible because most of it's going to the high end. They're not just terrible because they will continue a large budget deficit at a time when the government's going to try and reduce it. And so therefore they're going to cut spending. They're also terrible because they make our income tax system less progressive. They're actually going to rip an entire tax bracket out, so that everybody earning between $45,000 and $200,000 is paying the same rate of marginal tax. So they're effectively going to rip out the 37-cent bracket, which means that going forward, our tax system will be permanently less equal and less fair.
Permanently less fair.
The big rethink that's required here, of course, is the third stage of the personal income tax arrangements. The proposal, I think, was quite unfair at the time, unfair and unwarranted at the time from the day it was announced. But it's even more unfair and more unwarranted now. There's no honour in a government standing by what, in truth, is really a very dodgy commitment.
We've always opposed the stage 3 tax cuts that deliver $240 billion over the next decade to high income earners. Richard Dennis and his team have helpfully done the maths. Stage 3 tax cuts are grossly unfair. They're part of the old trickle-down theory, which has been shown up for what a dangerous farce it is.
What we need to do with the income tax is to protect its progressivity and bring more people into the base. And if we do that, we will maintain its resilience. We don't have to like taxes, but what we do have to understand is that this is the way that we manage to live together.
Eliza, this issue was pretty well canvassed at the Australia Institute's Revenue Summit, at which you chaired a panel and did a great job of it, I might add. But these came up a number of times as being unfair. I just want to ask you, in particular, Bernie Fraser and a few others mentioned them as being unfair and unwarranted. It was the Revenue Summit. What do these tax cuts do to revenue?
Yeah, I mean, they're worth $240 billion around about over the next 10 years. So that's a huge amount of money. And it's coming at a time when we particularly need revenue. So there are huge implications for not having this money to spend on improving the quality of public services instead. So, we've just come through a pandemic and it showed us how under-resourced our public services are. We have a significant amount of debt and the repayments on that debt are increasing. And we're facing a potential recession. This is a time where we need revenue. We don't need tax cuts.
Yeah, what the Treasurer keeps calling fiscal buffers, I believe, in all his press conferences.
So in the context of all of that, we need to make sure we're building our buffers to the extent that we can. And there are other factors working against us, including some pressures on the budget which were not disclosed or booked by the previous government.
Now, Matt, an idea that has emerged as this idea of repealing the tax cuts has gained a lot of traction. The defense of these tax cuts, the people coming out to say, no, wait, these are a good idea, are more or less saying, look, you're just attacking middle income earners. These tax cuts are going to help the people in the middle. Tell me a little bit more about those who are defending the stage 3 tax cuts. Where do they think the middle is?
Yeah, we've had some interesting ideas on what the middle is. So there's been kind of newspaper articles that have talked about the middle being, the people earning between $120,000 and $160,000 a year. That's the middle. So to put that in a bit of context, firstly, they are right. They're the people who will get the most from this stage 3 tax cuts, 120 to 160. They're going to get a big chunk of it. But if you earned $120,000 a year, you're in almost the top 10% of taxpayers. If you earn $160,000 a year, you're in the top 7% of taxpayers. So if you think that the middle is, basically this top tier of income, then yes. We heard the opposition leader say that average incomes are about $93,000 a year.
The average wage in our country now is about $92,000, and Anthony Albanese stood with workers, people such as fly in, fly out mine workers who sacrifice time away from their families, and they try and set themselves up financially. He told those people, as did Bill Shorten, that they are truly in his mind, in terms of honouring or committing to this tax cut, that they would be the beneficiaries now.
Well, that's actually wrong. It's just straight out wrong. Average incomes are actually $73,000 a year. Average full-time incomes are $93,000 a year. But if you earn $93,000 a year, that actually puts you in the top 20% of taxpayers. So our idea of average or normal is just so warped when the opposition leader is coming out and saying, well, average, those in the middle, are in the top 20%. And it's no wonder that, perhaps the coalition thinks that these tax cuts are fair if they think that, average Australians earn $93,000 a year. If you want to look at median income for everybody, then it's actually $63,000 a year. So that means that 50% of Australians earn more than $63,000 a year, and 50% of Australians earn less than $63,000 a year. So if you're concerned about people on $120,000 and $160,000, then perhaps you should spare a thought for people on the minimum wage, which is about $40,000. So if you're on $160,000, you're earning 4 times as much as somebody on the minimum wage. Somebody on the minimum wage earning $40,000 a year will get nothing from these tax cuts. Somebody on $160,000 a year will get $4,675 a year from these tax cuts. So yes, they're skewed to the top end, but if we have this weird kind of fantasy where we think that the middle is actually those at the very top, then they go to middle income earners. But
this reminds me of an amazing photo that I've seen of The Rock. Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. We all know he's
fan,
huge. I do love him. I do love him. But he's a very tall person, right? He's pretty big. And there's this amazing photo of him with Shaq and I think Charles Barkley. And he just looks tiny. He looks miniature because they're so tall. But he's like, I don't know, 6'3" or 6'4" or something. But they're, a foot taller than him because they're, amazing NBA players. And that's kind of what we're talking about here, isn't it? Like 120, sure, it's not a bank CEO, type of salary, but it's still not the middle. It's nowhere near the middle.
It's nowhere near the middle. You're absolutely right. And just to put this in context, right? If you work an 8-hour day, somebody on $160,000 a year earns in the first 2 hours the daily rate of somebody who is on the minimum wage. So by, from 9 till 11, they've already earned what somebody on the minimum wage will earn all of that day.
Yeah.
It's a considerable amount of money. It's not, Gina Reinhart money. It's not, bank CEO money, but it is a lot more. And that's why they're in the top 7% of taxpayers.
And why The Rock is tall.
Yes.
Doesn't matter if you put him next to Shaq. He's objectively tall.
If your definition of tall is no one is taller than me, then there's only one tall person in the world, right? If your definition of rich is there's nobody richer than me, then there's only one rich person in the world.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you'll always be able to find somebody who earns more than you.
They are actively choosing to give $244 billion over 10 years to people that are CEOs, that are billionaires, and that are politicians. All of those folk are going to get about a $9,000 tax cut every year. Now, we're in a cost of living crisis. I don't think anyone disagrees with that. Why, of all things, would you be giving tax cuts to the rich when people are struggling to meet their daily cost of living challenges?
Coming to this point about that Matt made about the difference between average income and median income. So it's like convenient to use average income because they are usually higher because they're dragged up by outliers up the top, right? So actually a median income is a much better measure to try and understand the middle, right? And yeah, it's $63,000. That's not very much more than that $45,000 threshold under which people get nothing.
Yeah, it's such a good point. Matt, before we come to this new research, I did just want to take a minute to ask about bracket creep because that's also come up a lot this week. Can you just quickly tell us what bracket creep is and if these stage 3 tax cuts are required to address it?
Yeah, bracket creep is where over time your income rises, in line with prices of stuff you buy. So let's say your income went up exactly as much as inflation. You're never actually better off because the amount of stuff you can buy with your income stays the same because it's increasing at exactly the same rate as the stuff you buy. But the average rate of tax, the amount of tax you pay as your income creeps up, actually increases. So you're actually paying more tax, which means you have less money in your pocket compared to the stuff you buy. So you're actually worse off. So the idea of bracket creep is that we should have tax cuts every now and then in order to compensate for the fact that our incomes are falling into higher and higher tax brackets and we're paying more tax. And there's an argument that stage 3 is needed to combat bracket creep. This is completely false. And the reason it's completely false is because the people who's suffering the most from bracket creep at the moment are low and middle income earners, whereas this overwhelmingly goes to high income earners who have been overcompensated for bracket creep. So if you look at who's being overcompensated for bracket creep and undercompensated, everybody earning $90,000 or more is overcompensated for bracket creep, and everybody earning less than $90,000 isn't even getting bracket creep from the stage 3 tax cuts. And the people at the very top, so people on $200,000 a year are getting $7,000 a year more than their bracket creep. So they're being massively overcompensated for bracket creep.
Sounds to me like there's other ways that you could address bracket creep there too, not just tax cuts.
We could reskill the stage 3 tax cuts and concentrate on bracket creep. But if we did that, we'd take an enormous amount out of the top. We give a lot less to the people at the top and we give a lot more to the people at the bottom.
Right. Eliza, we've released some new research this week that I wanted to talk to you about. So we've kind of gone through, it's bad when it comes to gender equality. The stage 3 tax cuts are bad when we look by occupation at who's going to benefit and who they're directed at. What happens when we look at age and who is the winners in terms of the generations from these stage 3 tax cuts?
Yeah, so we know that the benefits of the stage 3 tax cuts are unfairly distributed among Australian taxpayers, and this is particularly true when it comes to young people. So our new research shows that Gen Z, so people under the age of 25, will only receive 2.8% of the benefits, despite making up 12.7% of taxpayers. So this means that they're receiving $2.80 out of every $100 that is handed out as a result of these tax cuts. And yeah, young people are the biggest losers. On the other hand, Generation X will receive the largest share of the tax cut, so 41%.
Is that because basically they're kind of working age, they haven't retired yet, and they're probably at the peak of their careers?
Yeah, absolutely. So, this is primarily because young people are concentrated in low-paid jobs, coming back to that occupation point, and also low-paid sectors. So they're also paying less tax. So they're going to, of course, receive less tax back in return.
Yeah.
But this just comes to the point that the benefits of this money could be more evenly distributed among the Australian population if it was delivered through public services rather than tax cuts.
Yeah, because I imagine Generation Z is also facing some acute cost of living pressures at the moment, given they're on low incomes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they're potentially, arguably, they're the ones suffering the most because they have less financial buffer to compensate for the rising prices. And, you know, as we've talked about many times, real wages are lagging behind. So, yeah.
So essentially, the people most in need, the generation most in need of a fiscal buffer, in the Treasurer's words, might be Generation Z.
Yeah.
Rather interestingly, the most populous job in Australia is bottle shop attendants. This is an area where you get a lot of people working short hours, casual work. To be brutal, they're getting zero. You know, the stage 3 tax cuts only start kicking in once you earn over 45,000. There's nothing for anyone under that.
Eliza, let's zoom out a bit. These tax cuts are one of the most expensive budget announcements ever made in Australia, ever. They're so huge. I remember when John Howard announced the Murray-Darling Basin Plan, and it was $10 billion.
$10 billion.
Yeah, I felt like he was adjacent to Dr. Evil with that announcement. You know, like it just seemed so enormous at the time. Now these are $250 billion basically over the next 10 years. What are some of the things you were just talking about there in terms of public services, the other things that we could be spending this money on if we, and maybe that's a big if we want to make life easier for those who are struggling?
Yeah, so spending money on tax cuts instead of public services and programs, as we've said, represents a huge opportunity cost to the budget. And there are so many things that, I feel like the civil society and, the public service and public sectors are crying out for. And some of those things we can absolutely afford if we ditch the stage 3 income tax cuts. So things like we could make undergraduate university education free for domestic students at the cost of $30 billion over the next 10 years. That's a fraction of that $240 billion. We could also increase Commonwealth rent assistance to help people with the cost of putting a roof over their head, something that would really help young people. We could cover the cost of dental work under Medicare, which costs a lot of money, $91 billion over 10 years, but still less than that $240 billion.
Yeah.
We could also give a wage rise to aged care workers and childcare workers who we know are severely underpaid.
And we also know that aged care, something like half of residents in aged care in the Royal Commission are malnourished. Like there's other problems in aged care even after you get to wage rises for the poorly paid workers.
Yeah, it's so shocking how little they spend per resident, per meal in those, in residential aged care. And, there's really strong evidence to suggest that investing money in public services would deliver much stronger economic returns than spending money on tax cuts.
Now, people understand that a budget and governing is about choices. And they hear it loud and clear when the Prime Minister talks about how choices are being made. What this government is doing is choosing to keep the stage 3 tax cuts.
These tax cuts are huge, and I suppose they're so huge that they're one of the few things that make the submarine project actually look cheap. I mean, there's very little that can make those 12 subs that we may or may not eventually get look cheap. But look, honestly, these stage 3 tax cuts managed to do that.
Yeah. And what are they clocking at? Something like upwards of 100 billion?
When they were the diesel ones, we were looking at like 100 billion.
That was 100 billion.
Yeah, but now they're nuclear. It's all kind of hush-hush, and we don't actually know. We signed up to a blank check, basically.
Yeah. Well, traditionally those go really well, don't they?
Yeah,
Signing a blank
absolutely.
check.
Defence procurement, it's always under budget and on time, right?
It's not going to run over schedule either, I'm
No,
sure.
No, not at all.
So, Matt, just sticking, I guess, with the politics of this for a second, we're approaching the budget. The Prime Minister has come out and said we're probably sticking to this for this budget, but the May budget isn't far behind that. What are the politics of the stage 3 income tax cuts look like?
The stage 3 only come in July 2024. So we don't have to change them in the October budget. We could change them in the May budget. And the politics of it is that when the Labor Party made their decision that they were going to back these stage 3 tax cuts, when they voted for them all the way back in 2019, before the pandemic, the budget was in a very different place. The economy was in a very different place. Right now, the economy, we're facing inflationary pressures, and, an enormous tax cut would add to that inflation. The budget is in huge deficit. We've kind of come through the pandemic, and the government is now talking about bringing the budget back towards a surplus, trying to reduce the deficit. Now, if they're trying to reduce the deficit and at the same time they're handing out an enormous tax cut, that can only mean one thing, right? It must mean spending cuts. And we also have a government, Jim Chalmers, the Treasurer, is often heard saying, we can't even afford to fund good ideas. Well, they're funding enormous tax cuts. I mean, in the first year, these tax cuts will cost $17.7 billion just in the first year, and that'll grow over the next decade. And so they're the things that they're prioritising. I love budgets, Eb.
I do.
And the reason I love budgets is because you get to see what the government prioritise. And if they're saying, well, we can't fund good ideas, but we can fund a tax cut, what they're saying is that those tax cuts are more important than those good ideas. And that's what the budget tells us.
Okay, well, that's all we've got time for. Thank you very much, Matt and Eliza. This episode was recorded live on Tuesday, the 11th of October 2022, and things may have changed since recording. You can visit australiainstitute.org.au for all our latest Stage 3 income tax cuts research and content. We're on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. My Twitter handle is Ebony_Bennett with a NNT. Matt Grudnoff is at Matt Grudnoff, and Eliza Littleton is at Eliza Littleton. Our producer, Jennifer Macy, is at Jennifer Macy, with additional editing by Emily Perkins. Our theme music is by Jonathan McPhee from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. Stay safe out there, and thanks for listening.